All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. I'm Justin Nessery, Associate Professor of Politics and International Affairs here at Wake Forest University. The IMC is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and previously sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. The IMC is also affiliated with the Society for Political Methodology, who hopes that you will support quantitative research in political science by joining. The membership fee is just $10 a year for graduate students, and I will post a link that you can follow to join once we're done with this introduction. This week's speaker is Sarah Shugars, a PhD candidate at Northeastern University, giving a talk entitled The Structure of Reasoning, Measuring Justification and Preferences in Text. Sarah's talk will last about 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. And all questions will be held until the end of the talk, unless it's definitely a clarifying question. I can break in and ask if there's something really important, but otherwise we'll hold the questions to the end of the talk. A link to Sarah's paper and slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation, and I'll post those links in the chat window right after this introduction. Now I'd like to welcome Sarah Shugars to the International Methods Colloquium. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm very excited to be here and to share this work with you. As Justin mentioned, I'm a political scientist and a PhD candidate in the network science program at Northeastern. And I want to start by very broadly talking about some of my broader research agenda. So overall, I study how people talk and reason about their political preferences. And there's some reason to believe that this may be a problem in today's world. So the talk I'm showing today is particularly called The Structure of Reasoning, or if you don't mind having too long of a talk title, Can we measure individual variation in how people structure their political expressions, and do we really care anyway? Now I'll break this question down in just a minute, but I wanted to start with a spoiler alert. My answer to this question is yes. So there's a lot going on in this question. So to dig into it a little bit more, the questions here are, is there a way, do individuals structure their political expressions? So when people talk about their political preferences, does it have a structure in some way? Is there individual variation in this structure? Are there ways that we can measure this structure? And do we care whether we can do this or not? And in particular, I will argue that we care because there's a potential for behavioral insights from looking at this structure. And I want to be clear before I dive in that this idea is not new. If you go back through the public opinion literature, there's a rich line of research, particularly from the 50s through the 70s, that really thought about individual people and how they talked about and described their political preferences and thought about the structure of those preferences. And what's really exciting is that modern computational tools are starting to make this task tractable. So in the past, the people who were working on this would rely on in-depth interviews or hand coding of texts, which can be a great resource for understanding text in a rich way, but it's not really scalable if we wanted to apply it to a large corpus of text. So the general outline for my talk today is to first elaborate on the structure of political reasoning and to explain what I mean when I talk about structure. Second, to define an approach for inferring and measuring that structure. And third, to demonstrate that this approach has the potential for behavioral insights. And I'll use two distinct data sets in showing this. So when I say that political reasoning is structured, I mean specifically a network structure, and I will describe that again in some more detail in a minute. But just as sort of a quick introduction to network structure, networks are a really helpful model for understanding a range of systems. And the basic framework is that you have things and they're connected to other things. So the things are called nodes and the connections are called edges. And these systems can be used to describe social networks. You can have people connected to other people. They can be used to describe citation networks where papers are citing each other, or it's often used in legal frameworks to look at sort of what previous legislation is being cited. And there's lots of different ways that you can do this. What I'll be talking about today will be a little bit more conceptual in terms of nodes being concepts and edges being connections between those concepts. And again, I'll explain that in more detail in just a minute. But the basic idea here in terms of arguing that political reasoning is structured, so when a person expresses a political opinion, there is something that goes on in their head and there is something that comes out of their mouth, and those things are connected in some way. And what's particularly interesting is that both of these things have been shown to have a network structure. So, cognitive processes like remembering and learning have a network structure as we store and retrieve information in reference to sort of what's already in our brain. So, if we're learning something new, we learn it in the context of things that we already know. If we're justifying an opinion or arguing about something, that will also have a network structure as we sort of reinforce our points or justify our points using a related fact or refute points using related information. Um, and one important interlude here is, should we even care about political talk? And I would argue that we should care a lot about political talk. And there's several reasons for this. One is that the democratic ideal imagines citizens reasoning together. So while there's very good reason to think that this ideal is not being met in most settings, if we want to move towards that ideal and if we want to have a hope of having better political conversations, we need to understand the dynamics of political conversations as they exist, and in order to really think about interventions and strategies for making them better. Second, more broadly, democracy demands that citizens talk together. So even if we are sort of not trying to reach an ideal state of deliberative democracy, I would argue that it's a problem for democracy itself if families can't have Thanksgiving dinner together, or if people can't even begin to have conversations about politics, even if those conversations aren't meeting an ideal. And finally, political talk may reflect dominant messages. So one argument is that maybe we don't really care that much about what individual people say or think, because what they're saying is just sort of a reflection of the elite messages they're receiving. And if you believe that, and if you think that's the case, then it's still helpful to understand how people are articulating their beliefs, because even if that is sort of a reflection of elite messages, it gives insight into what messages are actually being received by people and sort of how people are expressing the messages that they're receiving. And one way we can think about this is through Zoller's receive, accept, sample model. So Zoller imagines if you ask somebody for their political opinion on a topic or whether they favor or oppose an issue, that they'll make a decision basically they'll receive information from elites or media sources, and then they accept some of that information selectively, and then they sample from the information that's available in their head in order to sort of come to a single point answer. Now, to be clear, Zoller was talking about specific preferences, and there's more recent work building off Zoller and Converse that's looked at the structure of preferences. The work that I'm talking about today is more about the structure of articulation of preferences, so not actually the preferences themselves, but we can still think about it in a similar framework. So people are receiving messages or talking points, they accept some of those messages, and the things that kind of stick in their brain might be things that are resonant with what they are predisposed to believe. And then if you ask them to explain their position on an issue, one could hope that they sort of reason through it and have a very thoughtful explanation of their position. But even more simply, you can imagine that they're sort of sampling from this latent network of stored ideas in their brain in order to express and articulate their view. So the argument here is that both structure and content influence the quality of political talk. So that's not to say that content isn't important. I would expect, and we would all expect that content to be very important. And if we're imagining a conversation between two people who disagree on a topic, that conversation would probably play out very differently than if they agreed on the topic. But the argument here is that structure is also important. And the work I'll be showing today explicitly ignores content in order to focus on the effect that structure might have or the signal that structure could be sending. So again, that's not to say that content isn't important, but sort of a future step in this work would be to look at both structure and content together, because a lot of the existing work only looks at content and kind of ignores structure. And part of why we can think of structure as being important is because it will send a signal to the person you're talking to. So it's often very clear if you're having a conversation, if the person is sort of trolling you or intentionally trying to provoke a response versus engaging in good faith. It that can often come across in sort of how they're expressing themselves. It could also influence receptivity to new messages. So going back to the idea that we sort of store information in our brains in a network sense, if somebody's saying something and making an argument to you, but you really have no context for understanding what they're saying, you might not really be able to get what they're saying, regardless of whether or not you agree with it. You may not even be able to sort of understand the premise of their point of view. And finally, it has the potential to sort of represent different philosophical approaches in terms of arguing what good moral judgment looks like. So the argument here is that structure is important because conversations, how they play out, doesn't just depend on what people say, but also on how they say it. So thinking about some of these different philosophical approaches, there's a great deal of work in moral philosophy that argues that good reasoning must be coherent. And this, of course, is for some definitions of good and for some definitions of coherent. And I'll be focusing today on sort of two particular lines of work, one from Sedgwick and one from Dancy. And to explain those a little bit more, we can think of sort of a baseline of having coherent reasoning, of sort of having a connected network structure. Dancy argues that situations are complex and complicated, and if you're going to make a good moral judgment, you need to be able to sort of make that judgment in the context of a lot of information and sort of what's specific to the situation. Whereas Sedgwick argues for something more of a hierarchical structure. So the argument there is that there are some moral claims that are so central and so important that if you're making a moral judgment, those claims should always take precedence, and no amount of context-specific information should change sort of what the central role is. So these are a couple of different ways in which we can think about sort of the network structures that we might run into and how they might sort of reflect people's ways of thinking and approaching problems, and then how it might influence people talking to each other. So more broadly, my work is interested in thinking about if we have two people and say one's a Democrat and one's a Republican. So this work could be done really in any context. My work tends to focus primarily on the American context. So I'll be using that as sort of a running example today. But if we imagine one's a Democrat and one's a Republican, will a conversation play out differently if sort of they both think and express themselves in similar ways versus if they think and express themselves in different ways? So this is sort of the long-term goal of this project. Obviously, that's a really big question. So in order to even start answering that question, the first step is to think about trying to infer this network structure at an individual level, and to develop measures that can infer this structure and then also show that that's a useful thing to do. So while this work is sort of aimed at understanding conversations and conversational dynamics, the focus today is really on understanding at an individual level, can we sort of infer how somebody's expressing their reasoning in text? And does that seem to be a meaningful thing to measure? And again, my answer is yes. So now that I've described a little bit more about what I mean by structure, I'll go through the approach for inferring and measuring the structure from text. So again, in any network model, you sort of have nodes and they're connected to each other by edges. So anytime you're setting something up as a network model, you should start with two questions. What are the nodes and what are the edges? So in this case, the nodes would be concepts and the edges would be connections between those concepts. Now, the problem here is that this immediately raises the question of what is a concept? If they're to be the nodes, then we need to understand what they are. And a concept can be sort of broadly understood as a compressed representation of information or a collection of related things. So if I ask you to, describe a room to me or describe like what is a building, you might give me a list of words that would describe that object. So a concept very broadly is sort of represented by a list of words, or more operationally, we can think of it as a collection of similar words. So one fortunate thing is this is sort of exactly what word embeddings are designed to do. So the idea here is that words themselves are high-dimensional objects and that can therefore be embedded in high-dimensional space, and that we can do this embedding in such a way that words which appear in similar contexts are geometrically close to each other. So the argument here is that similar words appear in similar contexts, and that by looking at a large corpus of text, we can identify sort of which words are similar and sort of how words embed in a high dimensional space. So for an example, imagine I see these two sentences. I took my dog to the vet and I took my cat to the vet. I might see these sentences and think a dog and a cat are kind of similar things because they appear in very similar contexts. Now, before I offend any dog or cat lovers, we may see other sentences like my dog plays fetch or my cat likes to sleep. And so then I might start thinking, well, a dog and a cat are kind of similar, but they're not quite exactly the same. They're a little bit more different than I had thought from those first sentences. And then I might see other totally random sentences like I caught a shuttle from the airport, in which case I still think that dog and cat are kind of close, but I know there's this other thing called a shuttle that's much further away. So if you imagine sort of going through this process over a large corpus of text, you can sort of have fine-grained distinction between what words are close to each other and what words are far away in terms of how similar they are to each other. So in the context of this approach, we can use these word embeddings to essentially identify which words point to the same concept as each other. So if words are geometrically close in a word embedding space, then they're considered to be similar words and therefore considered to be pointing to the same concept and therefore considered to be pointing to the same node. So said in a different way, the nodes in this network are essentially words or sort of collections of words that represent a broad concept. So if the nodes are words, then this raises the question of, it means the edges are connections between words, and it's not exactly clear how we might measure that. So there's two different things that we could think about here. One, if we take this example sentence of bodily autonomy is a basic human right, we could think about doing like a word co-occurrence to connect words to each other. So basically we would take a window and we would slide that window over the sentence, and then any words which co-occur within that window would be connected. And we might drop some stop words here also of things that we don't really care about that much. Now this approach can be helpful, but it's not really the best way to approach this specific task because this kind of approach assumes that connected concepts are syntactically close. So said another way, if we did a word co-occurrence on this, we might end up with bodily autonomy as a thing and basic human rights as a thing, but we wouldn't see any connection between those two things. They would be sort of totally separate contexts, where what this sentence is actually conveying is that these two concepts are connected to each other in some way. And how that's conveyed is actually through the grammatical structure of the sentence. So this is the approach that I'll actually use for inferring the edges here. So if we take the same sentence, we can look at the grammatical structure of this. And the grammar is essentially, it's designed to encode the language, encode ideas and the implicit connections that people are explaining between these things. So here we have that same sentence. Each word has a part of speech, and then each word also is connected to another word in the sentence and modifies it in some way. So we have bodily as an adjective modifying noun, basic and human are both adjectives modifying right, and there's sort of connections between all of these things. So when we look at the grammatical structure of this sentence, we start to see that we still have these two objects of sort of bodily autonomy and basic human right, but now we start to have a connection between those two concepts, and that connection is encoded in the grammatical structure. So the overall process for inferring a network structure is to first start by looking at the grammatical parse of a sentence. So you can infer the part of speech tags and also the grammatical structure, and this sort of lays the framework for what this network structure will look like. The next step is to turn any negative words into negative ties. So if we had a sentence that says X is Y, there would be a connection between them. But if it says X is not Y, then we would drop the word not, but turn it into a negative edge between those two concepts. The third is to remove any stop words. So language has a lot of words like the, is, and which aren't actually conveying that much information. So instead of having something that has a sort of a lot of nodes with every single word represented, we would drop any stop words so that we only have sort of the core words or core concepts represented. And then the final step is to use the word embeddings that I was talking about earlier to sort of merge any similar words and consider those the same node. So that would be the final step of this process. So you can do this on a corpus of text and then end up with network structures that look something like this. So these are two networks. The one that's in blue is from a liberal respondent. The one that's in red is from a conservative respondent. And this is from a Mechanical Turk study that I ran that I'll talk about in detail in a little bit more in a moment. So you can see that there's actually pretty rich network structures that emerge from doing this on text. And both of these are taken from texts that are about 100 words long. So the last challenge we have here is thinking about how to measure network similarity. So one way to think about this is if you look at the grids of different cities, if we look at Boston and New York, we can see that they have very different street layouts, but it doesn't quite, it's hard to figure out how to actually measure that difference because, the streets have different names, they're literally in different cities. So one of the ways we can think about this is how do we define measures that could help us sort of understand the difference between these different layouts. So sort of drawing on these three different ways of thinking about reasoning that I talked about earlier, I have a set of 7 network measures that each capture different elements of network structure. So in these 3 networks, they're all designed to have the same number of nodes and the same number of edges, and therefore they have the same density across all 3 networks. They're also all designed to have an average degree of 3, so that is also fixed across all 3 networks. And that can give you a better sense of sort of what these other metrics are measuring. So the clustering coefficient looks at sort of local density. So if this was a social network, it would be how many of your friends are friends with each other. So you can see that that sort of varies a little bit across these networks. The giant component percent looks at whether the networks are fully connected or whether they're isolated components. So this one in the middle has 3 different networks or components to it, so it does not have a giant component. The other 2, it's possible to get from any node to any other node, and so they have a score of 1 here. And then these last 3 measures sort of get to the hierarchical structure of the network, where there's one that's more homogeneous, and then it sort of goes to more heterogeneous. So in the homogeneous network, if I selected any one of these nodes and sort of gave you the node and its connection, you would not be able to tell me which node it was because all the nodes are exactly the same from a structural point of view. Whereas if you go to the other side of the graph, to the right side, the nodes have more variation in terms of one node has a very high degree, there are several nodes with very low degree. So the individual nodes sort of are more different from a structural perspective. So now the last step is to demonstrate the potential for behavioral insights. And we'll use 2 distinct data sets for doing this. And the core question here is, does the structure of expressed reasons, does it convey useful information? And so the first data set I'll use, I mentioned earlier, it's from a Mechanical Turk study with 100 subjects. And I had people do 3 different activities, but one of them was a free response text, and that's the one I'll be focusing on today. And each responded to 2 of 3 possible prompts, and then also people conducted completed an extensive demographic survey. The second data set is an ideological Turing test, and I particularly want to thank Dan Hopkins and Hans Noel for giving me access to this data set. It's a really fantastic data set and really great for what I'm trying to look at here, so I really appreciate them sharing it with me. And what's interesting is that respondents were asked to provide both a liberal and a conservative response to one of three topics. And subjects were explicitly instructed to write as if they actually held that view, and that their job was to convince the reader that they did hold that view. So I'll talk about each of these data sets in turn. With the first data set, what's nice is that because subjects completed this extensive demographic survey and survey of lots of different types of personality traits, we can look at whether sort of the network structures that we're seeing inferred from their text, whether it correlates to these known personality traits. So here's quickly many of the traits that we used. So moral foundations, big five, also looking at people's ideology, their political knowledge, and their openness to deliberation. And so the idea here is that for any network statistic, there's some personality measure and also a topic fixed effect. So we can look at correlations sort of between network statistics and personality measures. And I'll use sort of a reversed spectrum here for reasons that will become clear in just a moment. So blue on this correlation chart means that things are more correlated, and red means that they're less correlated. So what we see is that there's actually a pretty striking conservative liberal divide here. So that's the reason for the blue-red coding here. So on the left-hand side, you see that people who have conservative ideology or who score high on the traditionally conservative measures of purity and authority tend to have network structures similar to each other. And then on the right-hand side, we see that people who score high on progressivism or traditionally liberal measures of openness, openness to deliberation, they also sort of cluster together in terms of having similar types of network structures. So this suggests that there is something sort of behavioral going on in terms of how people choose to express themselves. And to explain this a little bit further, on the liberal side, we're seeing something that's kind of somewhere between the complexity and hierarchy models. So there are definitely nodes that seem to have higher degree or sort of more of a hub and spoke like look, but there's also a lot of interconnections, and there are sort of areas of denseness within these networks. On the conservative side, networks tend to be much less likely to be connected. They're sort of sparser overall. I do want to caveat though that, so this study was with 100 subjects and the pool skews liberal. So it ends up being about 33 conservative respondents that we're seeing for these results. So this does suggest together that there are meaningful correlations between personality traits and the types of network structures we're seeing sort of inferring from people's free response text on their beliefs or on their opinions of political issues. So this next data set, again, is sort of the ideological Turing test. And this is 1,000 subjects. And people responded to one of three possible prompts. And there's two different issues or two different questions that I'll ask with these data. One is because respondents provided both the conservative and the liberal position, we can look at whether the structures that we're seeing, whether it's driven more by ideology or more by sort of individual traits. And second, we'll also look at whether the structures that we're seeing suggest something about argument quality. So in thinking about whether sort of what drives similarity in network structure, we can think about whether are people more self-similar, so is my liberal essay more similar to my conservative essay, or are people more similar across ideology, so is my liberal essay more similar to your liberal essay? So we'll do this using a measure of network distance, where 0 would indicate that networks are identical, and then as we go further to the right, it means that networks are less similar. So if we see something like this, it would suggest that people tend to be more self-similar, with their own essays being more similar to each other than ideologically similar. And if we see something like this, it would suggest that ideology seems to be a bigger driving factor, in that sort of people with liberal ideology or sort of texts with a liberal position tend to be more similar to each other. So this could sort of indicate that people are just repeating known talking points rather than actually expressing themselves in any sort of meaningful way. And this is the results that we see here. And so what we see is a small but significant difference in sort of how people are self-similar versus ideologically similar. So this does suggest that people do tend to be more self-similar. So my conservative essay is going to be more like my liberal essay than my conservative essay will be to your conservative essay. So it's the similarities that we're seeing across essays seem to be more driven by individual sort of unique styles or preferences for expressing themselves rather than the actual ideology that they are expressing. Now, the second question is whether the structure can tell us anything about the quality of an argument. And specifically, what I mean by quality here is can we tell authentic responses from ironic responses? So one piece of information I glossed over a minute ago, when I was showing you those charts, I was only showing you the respondents who participated in the activity in good faith. So again, subjects were asked to write as if they actually held the view and were supposed to be aiming to convince a reader that they held that view. As it turns out, about half of respondents did not do this. Only about half actually participated in the activity as it was intended. So this gives us an interesting corpus where we have people who basically gave intentionally bad answers or ironic responses. And this would typically be a somewhat interactive portion, but I'll just give you a moment to pause after I ask each question. But the idea here, so I will give you a position or a sort of an excerpt of text that was received from a prompt. It'll be either the liberal or conservative position, and then you will silently think to yourself about whether this was written by a conservative or by a liberal. So the first one is the liberal position on abortion is that a woman has the right to determine what happens to her body. Now you can imagine, was this written by a conservative or by a liberal? And if you guessed liberal, you would be correct. So this text would get a coding of 1 and be considered a person who authentically participated in the activity. The next one, also the liberal position on abortion, it is okay to murder. So you can think about whether this was written by a conservative or by a liberal. And if you said conservative, you would again be correct. So this text would get a coding of 0 and be labeled as ironic and not genuinely representing the liberal position on this topic. So now we'll do the conservative position. So women need guidance from more superior men. Was this written by a liberal or a conservative? And if you said conservative, you would be correct. So again, this would get a coding of 0 and be considered an ironic response. If you said liberal, you are correct. So this would be considered an ironic response that doesn't genuinely present the conservative position. And finally, all life is sacred. Now, I may have tricked you with this one because this was actually written by a liberal, but it was somebody who participated in good faith in the activity. So this gets a coding of 1 and is considered to be an authentic response. So again, the question here, given that we have these texts where some people participated in good faith and some people did not, can we tell whether a text that we're seeing is sort of an authentic response that actually followed through on the prompt and tried to represent that point of view genuinely, or was it more of an ironic response that did not attempt to represent that view genuinely? So there's a few different things we can do here. One is if we just sort of randomly guess, we would be right about half the time. The sample does skew a little bit in favor of people who did participate in good faith. So if we guess that every response was authentic, we would be right about 56% of the time. We also might think that word count would be a valuable way of looking at this. So perhaps sort of authentic responses tend to be longer, whereas ironic responses tend to be shorter. And indeed, this does give us a lot more predictive power in terms of classifying responses as authentic or ironic. But we can also look at the network features and sort of the structure of the text. And we see that gives us a little bit more of an improvement as well. You know, it's not a large signal, but this does suggest that there is some information that's being conveyed in the structure of the text that people are writing. Something that sort of helps differentiate authentic from ironic responses. So to get into exactly what that is, so these are the results of 2 different models. So here we can see in the red that word count is in fact doing quite a lot of work in terms of sort of classifying things ironic or authentic. But also we see that several of the network measures in the model 2 are doing work as well. So things like average degree, density, and whether or not there's a giant component um, also seem to be indicating something. And what these measures in particular are saying is it seems to be that the authentic responses, if we think of sort of the Aristotelian ideal of a good argument, where there's a major premise followed by a minor premise, the authentic responses tend to have that pattern a little bit more, where people are saying something and then they're backing that up somehow. Whereas in the ironic responses, it's much more likely that people are just like saying something and then not backing it up at all. And if we put these two models together and sort of use all of these features, we see very similar results. So again, this suggests that there is something that we can find out about argument quality from the structure of these texts. So I started this talk by thinking about whether we can measure individual variation and how people structure their political expressions, and whether this is a valuable thing to do. And I would continue to argue that the answer to this question is yes. The way in which people talk and structure their beliefs or sort of express themselves does seem to be sending a signal of some sort. Again, this isn't to say that content is not also important, but if we want to understand sort of the dynamics of how political conversations play out, it's not enough to just look at the content, but we also need to look at sort of how people choose to express themselves, how well they justify or don't justify their arguments. And this could have implications for sort of the ability of people to really participate in meaningful conversation, even if they continue to disagree. If people are sort of talking past each other and talking in ways that the other person doesn't even understand what they're saying, or sort of how that's a logical argument, then we are much, much less likely to have productive political conversations. So in conclusion, this work presented a new method for inferring the structure of expressed reasonings. I found small but meaningful variation among individuals, and this variation does seem to be correlated with known personality traits, which suggests that these structures are picking up on something real or something that's meaningful to political behavior. And together, this suggests that looking at the structure of how people talk about their political preferences has the potential for new insights into the dynamics of public opinion and political conversations. So thank you very much, and I am happy to take any questions.
Oh. Got to raise that little window. All right. Thank you, Sarah, for that presentation. At this point, Sarah Shugars is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that's at the bottom of your webinar window. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I have some questions as well.
Sure.
So let me start maybe with a very sort of wide scope question, which is, does the structure of a person's reasoning network determine their ideology, or does the structure of their ideology determine their reasoning network?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I don't have sort of empirical evidence to answer that fully. My hypothesis is that so part of what makes it complicated is that a lot of the personality traits I'm looking at are sort of known to be correlated with ideology. So the idea there is that people have personality traits, and those personality traits lead to ideology. And I would expect that there's sort of two different effects going on here, where people might sort of have personality traits that predispose them to express themselves in certain ways. And so that would be more of a personality first measure or approach. It's also possible that, if people are sort of repeating elite talking points, then we would see ideology leading to the structure. And it's quite possible that both of those things are going on. What I'm seeing in the Turing test data is that it does seem to be more personality driven than ideology driven, which may mean that people aren't repeating talking points as much, and that it's more individual style or sort of preferences for expression.
So I'm thinking about how this connects to much older models of ideology and partisanship, like the Michigan model, which essentially, I'm going to draw on some very old information, or at least old relative to me. I haven't seen it in a long time. But they're the so-called funnel of causality, right, where you have socioeconomic characteristics which funnel into, your background, which then funnels into your partisanship. And essentially, to summarize that very coarsely, where you come from determines who you are, right? Your family and your background. It would be pretty straightforward to say, well, it's just possible that background is what's structuring the idea networks, which then creates your ideology. Is there some way of us sort of sorting that out, figuring if that's how it's happening or that's not how it's happening? Is there something else going on, or what?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question and something that's really interesting to think about. One of the things I would be interested in looking at there is thinking about processes of code switching. So, in the Turing test kind of gets to this, where people are saying the liberal and conservative point of view. But if you think about it, like if you gave people a prompt where it's like, pretend that you're explaining this to your colleague or explaining it to your mother or grandmother, something like that, where people are sort of explaining it, but in different contexts, and see if people sort of continue to talk in the same way, in which case it would sort of be more of this personality thing versus like if they change the way in which they're talking based off the context. Which you might still expect there to be some sort of like overall personality force that's governing it, but you might then see more variation and more subtlety in how it's expressed.
We have a question from Robert Vidigal. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for your great talk. I really enjoyed it. My name is Robert Vidigal of Stony Brook University, and I also work with semantic networks. How many, two questions. First, how many words did each dataset have to generate your word embeddings? Or are you using a pre-trained embedding? I ask this because we know that embeddings fare better in large corpuses of text. And two, some theories argue that all human reasoning is affectively charged. Thus, in your modeling, do the nodes also incorporate affect or only the edges?
Great questions. So the texts tend to be very short. So in the Mechanical Turk study, it's 100 people. Each text is about 100 words. In the Turing test data set, it's 1,000 people and texts are about 60 words or so. So absolutely not enough text in order to train my own embeddings. I do use pre-trained embeddings using the Google News corpus. There is a new paper out that some of you may be familiar with. I sort of put it in the footnotes here, but didn't actually explicitly call it out. But from Pedro Rodriguez and Arthur Sperling, fantastic paper. Look it up if you haven't seen it, where they look at sort of the difference between using pre-trained embeddings versus training your own embeddings, and sort of the effects of different parameter choices in training your embeddings. And the good news for me is they do find that in most contexts, it's fine to use pre-trained embeddings. So that is what I do here.
And then the other question is, do the nodes incorporate affect or only the edges?
Yeah, so at this point in the model, the model only incorporates the edges and does not incorporate affect very strongly, unless, like, if somebody explicitly says something negative, you can have a negative edge. But I think it's a bit of a stretch to claim that that's capturing affect.
So one thing I've noticed just as an observer of American politics, because you mentioned a lot of your works in American, is that particularly in the Republican Party, but also to some degree in the Democratic Party, there's been the emergence of a sort of a new dimension of reasoning, which is old school Republicans, certainly Nixon Republicans, but even Reagan Republicans don't think or talk like Trump Republicans. Mm-hmm. In a variety of different ways. You might call it populism or whatever. There's a lot of different ways you could think about it. And there's a sort of a similar thing going on with comparing somebody like Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton to a more populist liberal like Bernie Sanders. is there, first of all, is there any evidence that those distinctions are real in reasoning? And if you don't know, is there some way we could actually figure that out?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I want to do with this kind of model is to look at things like within party differences, just to what you're getting at. Part of what I also find exciting about it, so like the texts I've been using have intentionally been very much in the sort of charged American politics context. Um, but so like in a lot of ways, it's not surprising that the results I'm seeing sort of fall along a right left spectrum because of the types of questions that I'm looking at. Whereas, if we look at other texts, we might see different sort of axes of sort of who clusters with who. And by having a model that looks only at individual level traits or texts, we can sort of figure out the dimensions along which people cluster. So that could mean sort of looking at stump speeches from Tea Party Republicans versus more traditional Republicans, and trying to see if they sort of fall along a spectrum in some way or cluster in different ways. It could mean looking at something that's a seemingly less politically charged topic and seeing if there's sort of different ways in which people cluster in terms of race and gender and sort of intersectional identities. So it doesn't always have to be a left-right spectrum, sort of depending on what types of things we're looking at.
So speaking of Trump, I'm curious how your analysis speaks to how people observe and evaluate information that's presented to them. So, for example, if I show you the transcript of the call between President Trump and the Prime Minister or President, I can't remember, of Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
you might interpret that transcript as telling you something very different depending on what you already believe and your existing network of concepts. And that's just one example that's in the news a lot right now, but there are a lot of other possible examples. But I didn't see a lot in your talk about sort of how those networks sort of mediate new information, or sort of how they grow. And of course, the real, I think, $1 million question is, how does someone change from being in one kind of network structure to another?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was not a question. Let me try to form that in the phrase of a question. How do people absorb new information according to their network structure, and how do network structures change?
Yeah. Both really good questions. So I would expect that sort of the way so if we imagine that people have this latent network in their heads, which I wouldn't expect they literally have a network in their head, but if it makes sense to sort of model people's cognitive processes as a latent network, I would expect that to mediate sort of what information they're willing to accept as they receive new information and sort of exactly how they receive it. The model as it's set up right now has not looked at those questions, but especially as I sort of bring this into more deliberative settings where people are talking to each other, trying to see what pieces of information stick when people say something versus which pieces of information seem to sort of go right by them. And then also seeing if we can predict that based off the structure of the network that they have. Similarly, I would hope that people's networks grow over time. So there are some models of political reasoning which would say that sort of people just have their opinions and those opinions never change. But we certainly have seen cases like gay marriage in the US or same-sex marriage in the US is a great example of this, where over a period of 10 years, there was a dramatic shift in public opinion on same-sex marriage. And so it is clear that there are times when people change their opinions on things. So thinking about sort of what that process looks like in terms of, are they adding new information? Are they sort of connecting pieces of information they hadn't connected before? What types of things are leading to that change is all stuff that I'm really interested in looking at in the future.
I mean, to me, so there's a very simplistic version of this, which is there's a very strong connection between Obama and bad in Republican networks, and a very strong connection between Obama and good in Democratic networks, and therefore, it's all sort of That's why when you present people with the same pattern information, but you just change the noun, suddenly their opinions, radically change about how appropriate is certain behavior. Well, if you put in the proper noun, suddenly people get very different. That's kind of I'd hate to believe that's all that there is going on, but at least that's one hypothesis. Another is it's actually much more subtle than that, and it has to do with like a whole wide variety of different things. In other words, that would imply, if it's more subtle than that, that there are actually things, for example, Donald Trump or Joe Biden could do that would turn their supporters against them. They just haven't been doing those things. There's a lot of freak out right now, on Twitter at least, about sort of our political culture, and I think that's kind of that's at the heart of it, right? And it would be really important to know, like, okay, how do these people change their mind? How do other people, or how do we change our minds? There's a question from the audience, so I want to jump to that. Elizabeth Mitchell says, "Thanks for the interesting talk. I'm wondering about your result that people's responses about different ideologies are self-similar. To what extent do you think this is driven by individuals' level of political interest or engagement? If that does play a role, is there a way to distinguish, using your methods, between people who are able to echo talking points from both sides of the ideological spectrum and people who have devoted more thought to reasoning about these issues on their own?"
That is a fantastic question. I actually have not looked at this in terms of sort of how it varies by the political interest of the respondents. So that's a great idea of something to look at. Thank you. And I'm sorry, can you repeat the question part of it again? I got too excited about the suggestion.
If it does play a role, so if individuals' level of engagement plays a role in their thinking about ideologies, is there a way to distinguish between people who are just echoing talking points versus people who are reasoning on their own?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I think this in part is where content can come in as being important in addition to structure. So with people sort of repeating talking points, you would tend to see more, like, it seems like that would lead to more similarity by ideology, whereas people reasoning on their own or potentially more skeptically sort of expressing the talking points using their own words, you would see more of that self-similarity. So again, in the data set, I am seeing more of the self-similarity, and it would be, I think, really interesting and important to look at that by sort of political knowledge to get a sense of whether, if it happens to be mostly, elites or very politically engaged people who are self-similar, that would be a very different story than if it's more broad than that. Having looked through many of these responses, my sense is that many of the people are not repeating talking points or sort of political elites, which I guess does make me optimistic that people do seem to be genuinely expressing their own views. Sort of how much you want to put into individual reasoning from that can vary, but that people are sort of using their own words and seem to be thinking about these issues.
All right, well, we're all out of questions, so I would like to thank Sarah Shugars for being our presenter this week. Her presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast, if you'd like to share the presentation or watch again later. I also want to invite you to join us next week, Friday, November 8th, when we will host Tara Slow from UC Berkeley, Columbia, and NYU. Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Sarah, thanks for giving a talk this week.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Take care.
And I hope to see everyone next time.